The forge behind Thomas Brennan ran hot even with the door open, and the sound of it, hammer on iron, iron cooling in the slack tub, carried far enough that Cora Danvers heard the shop before she saw it. She stood at the edge of the yard with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a scrap of paper in her hand, the ink gone soft where her thumb had pressed it too many times. Wanted, shop helper, striker's work, inquire within. Thomas came out from under the lean-to with a length of axle iron balanced across both arms, saw her, and set it down against the fence before he said anything. "You lost?" "No," she held up the paper. "I'm here about this." He looked at her the way a man looks at a tool he isn't sure fits the job. Not unkind, just measuring. "Striker's work. You know what that means?" "Working the bellows, moving stock, holding the tongs steady while you swing." She said it plainly, the way a person recites something they've watched done 100 times. "My father was a smith. I grew up in his shop." "Grew up watching or grew up doing?" "Both." He didn't answer that right away. Behind him, near the fence, a girl of 6 or 7 crouched low, arranging pebbles along the bottom rail, watching the stranger without seeming to. "This isn't light work," Thomas said. "I've got more repairs waiting than I can finish alone. I need someone who can swing a sledge when I call for it, not someone I'm minding half the day." "Let me stay," Cora said. "I'll work for my keep. Give me the work I can do, and I'll prove the rest." He glanced past her toward the house, where a woman near 60 was crossing the yard with a full water bucket, her steps careful, one shoulder dropped lower than the other from the weight of it. He watched her set the bucket down twice before she reached the porch. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, turning back. "East of here, smaller town. My father's shop closed when he passed." She didn't reach for more than that. "I've been asking after work since I came in on the coach." "Family?" "None left to speak of." He was quiet a moment, turning the axle iron at his feet with the toe of his boot, though there was nothing left to check in it. Behind him, the girl set one more stone in her row and glanced up, not at Cora, but at her father, waiting to see what he'd decide before she did. 3 months, Thomas said finally. "Meals and a place to sleep while you're here. You do what I tell you, when I tell you. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and there's no hard feeling either way." 3 months, Cora agreed. He picked the axle iron back up, nodded once toward the shop like that settled it, and walked in without waiting to see if she'd follow. She followed. Cora's place to sleep turned out to be a narrow space off the kitchen, walled in by a curtain instead of a door, with a cot pushed against the flue, where the bricks stayed warm past midnight. "It'll do for now," Thomas said, setting her bag down inside it himself, the way a man closes a subject before it opens. The woman with the water bucket turned out to be Josephine Reed, who looked Cora over once, top to bottom, then went back to peeling potatoes like the inspection had already told her everything she needed. "Mrs. Reed," she said without looking up again. "I've kept this house since before that girl was born. You'll do the heavy carrying now." "My back's told me plain enough it's done with it." Thomas laid out her duties before finishing his coffee the next morning, flat and unadorned. Water, wood, whatever Mrs. Reed couldn't lift anymore. The shop when he called for her, not before. "Lily minds herself well enough," he added. "Doesn't need looking after so much as looked in on." Lily didn't speak to Cora that first week, only watched. From the fence, from the porch step, once from the doorway of the room Cora slept in, gone before Cora turned around. Mrs. Reed talked plenty, but mostly about the work itself. Which pot scorched fastest, how Thomas liked his coffee before noon and wouldn't touch it after. "He's not unkind," she said one evening, working a needle through a torn cuff. "Just careful with what he lets himself need. Was different before." In smaller pieces over the following days, Mrs. Reed filled in the rest. Not a story told all at once, but handed over as it was useful. She'd come to the house when Thomas's wife was carrying Lily, hired on to help with the heavy months, and stayed after when the fever took hold a few weeks past the birth, and never let go. 6 years now. "Told myself I'd go once the girl didn't need minding every hour," she said, not looking up from the mending. Girl doesn't need it anymore. I'm the one who does. Needs somewhere to be useful. She flexed her hand once, slow, testing whether it would close all the way. The shop, when Thomas called her into it on the fourth day, was smaller than her father's had been, but arranged the same practical way. He set her to sorting stock by size, showed her the bellows rhythm he wanted, corrected her grip on the tongs twice without much comment either time. She caught on fast enough that by the second afternoon he stopped watching her hands so closely. That evening, riding by the kitchen lamp, she answered a letter that had followed her from the coach stop, from Ben Sutter, who'd apprenticed under her father the last 2 years before she left, and who was working iron for a railroad repair camp some 20-odd miles east now that the shop back home had closed. His letter said little beyond the ordinary, except one line near the end. His contract there ran only through the fall, and he hadn't yet decided what came after. She wrote back briefly, told him where she'd landed, and thought no more of it before sealing the letter to post in town. Lily set her stones down that night on the kitchen table, 3 feet from where Cora was writing, closer than she'd come all week. Neither of them spoke. Cora only moved her lamp to give the girl more light, and went back to her letter as if nothing had shifted at all. The work settled into something that almost resembled a routine, which was how Cora came to believe she could carry more of it than she could. It was a Tuesday in the 3rd week, hot for the season, and Thomas was drawing out a set of brake levers, long stock, awkward stock, the kind that needed a second pair of hands at the far end while the near end took the hammer. Tongs, he said, and she took them. She'd held for her father 100 times, but he'd worked lighter stock in his last years, shorter, and she'd forgotten what it was to hold for a man whose swing hadn't gone soft with age. By the 4th heat, her forearms had begun to go hollow, not painful, just gone somewhere, the way a limb does when it's asked past its measure. She told herself it would hold through this heat, and then she'd say something. "Turn," Thomas said. She turned it, slower than she should have. Again. This time her right hand didn't answer the way she'd asked. The tongs slid through her palm, the far end dipped, and when she snatched to correct it, the hot stock swung against the inside of her wrist and stayed there for the half second it took her to let go. The bar rang off the dirt floor. Thomas dropped his hammer, had her arm under the slack tub water before she'd finished making the sound she made. "Hold it, longer than you think." The water hurt worse than the burn had. A thin line of white rose along the inside of her wrist, the length of a finger and no wider. Mrs. Reed came out with a rag and a jar of tallow, looked at the arm, looked at Thomas, and said nothing at all in a way that filled the whole shop. It wasn't until the arm was wrapped that Thomas spoke again. "How long had your arms been going before you dropped it? 2 heats? 3? She thought about giving him a smaller number. 3. So 3 times you knew, and 3 times you decided I didn't need to. I thought I could finish the heat. You could have. You nearly did." He turned to face her. "That's the part you're not hearing. If you'd made it, I'd have never known your arms were gone. And I'd have called for you again tomorrow, on something heavier. Because you'd have taught me you could take it." "A shop can survive a weak arm," Thomas said. "There's 100 ways around a weak arm. It cannot survive somebody pretending the arm is still strong, because there's no way around that at all." "My father let me hold for him." "Your father was a smith, and I'd guess he knew to the minute when your hands went because he'd watched them go 1,000 times. I've watched you 3 weeks. I don't know your hands yet, so you have to tell me. That's the whole arrangement." "It won't happen again," she said. "It'll happen again. You'll get tired, and you'll want to finish, and you'll be wrong about which one matters." He picked up his hammer. "Just say it out loud next time." He didn't send her out of the shop. What happened instead was quieter. He laid out the work differently after that. She'd take the mornings with Mrs. Reed and Lily, the water and the wood. She'd take the accounts, since he'd been keeping those on the back of feed bills. She'd go into town twice a week for stock and coal, so he'd stop losing half a day doing it himself. "That's not Stryker's work," she said. "No, but it's the work that needs doing, and you can do all of it." She took it and told herself she took it because it was sensible and because he was right about her arms. All of that was true, It still sat in her chest like a stone for the better part of a week. That she'd come here as a smith's daughter, and inside of a month had been moved into the house, exactly where every man who'd ever turned her down assumed she belonged. The difference was that Thomas hadn't assumed it. He'd tried her, and she'd shown him, and there was nobody to be angry at but herself. The burn scabbed and peeled through the end of the month. Lily looked at the wrapped wrist every morning for 4 days running, and on the 5th, without being asked, carried the water bucket from the pump herself, half full, 3 trips instead of 1, none of it spilled. Cora didn't thank her. She had the sense that thanks would have ended it. She just filled the pot from what the girl brought and let her make the 4th trip too. The accounts, when Cora finally sat down with them, told a story Thomas hadn't meant to tell. He kept them on whatever paper was nearest, feed bills, the margins of a seed catalog, numbers added and re-added until the ink went thick with corrections. "You undercharged the Hollis order," she said on the 3rd evening, laying 2 scraps side by side. "Twice. Hollis pays on time. That's worth something." "It's worth something if what he's paying covers your iron and coal. It doesn't. You priced this at what iron cost 2 years ago. You're near enough giving him the work for the price of standing at the forge." "I don't keep the prices written anywhere. I just remember what I paid last." "Then you're remembering wrong, and it's costing you." She didn't soften it. "May I fix it? Not change what you charge. Just write it plain, so you're deciding on purpose instead of by memory." He watched her a moment. "Go on, then." She built it the way her father had taught her. A page for what came in, a page for what went out, a running note of what was owed and by whom, each customer's name, the date of the work, the iron and coal it had cost, the hours, the price, the balance due. Simple enough that Thomas could read it at a glance, once he stopped expecting it to be complicated. By the 2nd week, she'd started writing the tickets herself for new work, job, materials, price agreed before the first heat, handing them to Thomas to sign before he began. He signed the first few without comment. By the 5th, he'd started reading them all the way through. "You've got Whitfield's wheel repair priced higher than I'd have set it," he said one evening. "You're using more coal on that repair than you think. I watched you do the last one. It ran 2 heats longer than what you charged for." He turned that over. "You watched that closely?" "I watch most things closely. It's mostly all I've had to do with my hands lately." He let it pass without much weight, though something in his jaw eased, like a man deciding not to take offense at a true thing. Lily found her way to the ledger before she found her way to conversation, sitting across the kitchen table most evenings now, her tin box of stones open beside Cora's papers. Neither spoke through most of it. It was Lily who broke the pattern first, nudging a stone half an inch toward Cora's side of the table without looking up. "Is that one for me?" Cora asked. Lily didn't answer, which by now Cora understood wasn't a no. The next evening there were 2 stones on her side, placed there before she arrived. She left them where they were and went on with the accounts, unremarked. It was smaller progress than the burn had been, and slower, and she trusted it more for that. Mrs. Reed noticed before either of them said a word. "She hasn't sat at that table with anybody since her mother," she said one night, drying the last dish. "Don't know what you're doing different. Might be you're just not asking her to." By the end of the month, the ledger balanced clean for the first time in longer than Thomas could say, and Lily's stones had crept 1/3 of the way across the table toward Cora's papers, one evening at a time, never all at once. Caleb Mercer rode out to the shop himself, which Thomas said afterward was the first sign of how much the man needed the work done right. He was a freight outfit manager, lean and sun-worn, with the particular patience of men who've learned time costs money. "6 wagons, he said, laying a hand-drawn sheet on the bench. "Loading out for the high camp in 3 weeks. Supplies, tools, powder for the new dig. Axle clips are worn through on 4 of them. Tire bolts backed out on near every wheel, and I need reinforcing straps built fresh for 2 that took a beating on the last run." Thomas studied the sheet. "Front and rear both?" "Front wheels are smaller stock, rear are heavier. You'll know that better than I do. I need it done inside 2 weeks. Missed the window, and we're stuck till the mountain road closes for the season. Mercer held out his hand. Can you do it? Thomas shook it before he'd fully finished the arithmetic, which Cora noted and said nothing about until Mercer had ridden off. 2 weeks, for 6 wagons worth of fittings, on top of everything already waiting. I know what I said yes to. I'm saying we should know exactly what it costs before we're in the middle of it and finding out. They worked it out that evening at the kitchen table. Front axle clips and tire bolts for the smaller wheels, rear for the larger, straps for 2 wagons cut to Mercer's drawing. Cora wrote it out as a schedule, with a half-day held back at the end for anything that ran long. That leaves no room for a bad day, Thomas said. No, it doesn't. I don't have one to give you. Not on a schedule this tight. The work took over the yard. Thomas at the forge from before light most mornings, Cora at the bellows when he called, and between calls, sorting stock into front and rear piles she'd marked with chalk on the workbench. Mrs. Reed took over more of the house without being asked. Lily took to sitting on an upturned crate just inside the shop door some afternoons, counting her stones less now and watching the work more. In the second week, Cora noticed the calendar behind the workbench. Mercer's deadline counted down in Thomas's hand, and beneath it, in smaller writing, another date circled twice. The end of her own 3 months, arriving within days of his. Neither of them mentioned it, but she found herself doing the arithmetic some nights, lying awake behind her curtain, listening to Thomas's boots still moving in the shop long after supper. She rose one such night and found him at the workbench past midnight, checking a stack of tire bolts against the drawing for the 3rd time. You should sleep. You'll want steady hands tomorrow more than tonight's hour. Wanted to be certain before morning. They're certain. I checked them myself before supper. He looked up, surprised. Front and rear both, twice each. I know what's writing on this one. In the lamplight, he looked older than he had 3 weeks before. Mercer said something today, writing out. Told me if this run goes well, there's talk of the shop on 3rd Street losing the mail contract come spring. Said he'd rather give steady work to a shop that builds things to last. Then we finish it right, Cora said. Not fast, right. That's what I told him. He looked at her a moment longer than the conversation required. Go to bed, Cora. Morning's coming, whether we're ready for it or not. She went, and lay awake anyway, the 2 circled dates sitting in her mind the way Lily's stones sat in their tin box. Small things, carefully counted, adding up to more than their size suggested. The mistake happened on an ordinary Thursday, in the unremarkable middle of the work, which was later part of what made it hard to see coming. Cora had taken to writing the day's tickets the night before, so Thomas could start the fire each morning without losing an hour to sorting. He'd stopped double-checking her figures against the drawing sometime in the first week, once he'd seen enough of her tickets prove true. That Wednesday night, tired in a way she didn't register until later, she copied the next day's cuts from Mercer's drawing. 4 front axle clips at the smaller measure, 8 rear at the larger. Her hand, moving faster than her eye was checking, set the numbers down reversed. 8 for the front, 4 for the rear. Neither of them caught it. Thomas trusted the hand that wrote it more than the numbers themselves by then. They cut and shaped through Thursday and into Friday, and it wasn't until the trial fit against Mercer's own wagons that the error became plain. The 8 front-sized clips gapped loose against the heavier rear axles. The 4 rear-sized clips crowded too large against the front, forced on with an effort that told Thomas, before he said anything, they'd never hold under load. He stood at the 3rd wagon a long moment, turning a misfit clip over, and said nothing at all, which was worse than if he had. How many are we short? Cora asked, already knowing. 4 rear we don't have. 4 front we've got wrong-sized and can't use. He set the piece down carefully, the way a man sets down something he's trying not to throw. 2 days left before Mercer expects to load. She'd pulled her own copy of the ticket from her apron pocket and saw it there plain as anything, the numbers reversed, the mistake sitting in her own ink. It's mine, she said. I wrote it wrong. I read it before I cut anything. His voice was flat, working hard to stay that way. I've read every ticket you've written for 2 weeks and never once checked it against the drawing myself, because you'd earned that. I earned this too then, same as you did. Well, that doesn't fix 4 clips we don't have and 4 we can't use. No, it doesn't. He gauged the light left in the day. We can reforge the 4 rears from what stock we've got if we start now. The 4 fronts might be salvageable, cut down, might not. They worked past dark, Cora holding the tongs when he called for it, her arms telling her nothing but the truth of what they could bear. By the time they banked the fire, 4 rear clips cooled correctly sized in the slack tub. 3 of the misfit fronts had been cut down and reworked. The 4th was too far gone to save. That left them 1 clip short, with Saturday's light the only time remaining before Monday's load. Cora didn't sleep much that night. No room for a bad day, she'd told herself, weeks before. She'd written the schedule. She'd made the bad day happen anyway. By morning, she'd decided what to say. I'll tell Mr. Mercer myself when he comes. It was my mistake. You think that's what you owe him, an explanation? I think it's what's true. It's true. It's also not the thing that gets 4 wagons instead of 6 ready to roll Monday morning. He set his cup down. We've got 1 day left and 1 clip short. Explaining doesn't forge iron. Working does. They spent Saturday at the forge from first light, reworking the last salvageable scrap into a clip that held. Tested twice before either called it finished. By evening, 4 of the 6 wagons stood ready. The other 2 waited, their rear fittings still short. Sunday brought no more hours than any other day, and no stock worked itself into being overnight. Monday morning, when Caleb Mercer rode into the yard with 2 of his drivers, Thomas met him at the gate. 4 wagons are ready, Thomas said, plain, no softening in it. Fully fitted, tested twice over, 2 aren't. We had an error partway through the week, my error in the end, whatever caused it, and didn't have stock enough left to make up the difference. Mercer's face didn't move for a long moment. Show me, he said finally. Mercer walked the 4 finished wagons in silence, running his hand along each clip, testing the give of every bolt with a wrench from his saddlebag. He crouched at the reinforcing straps longest and said nothing until he'd checked the 4th wagon twice. These are better than what the 3rd Street shop gave me last spring, he said, straightening. Doesn't change what I've got standing in this yard, though. 4 wagons don't make a 6-wagon train. I know it, Thomas said. I could hold you to the contract as written. Penalty clause covers exactly this. Thomas didn't reach for an excuse. You could. That's your right. Mercer looked past him toward the shop, where Cora stood in the doorway, not hiding what she'd overheard. You the one wrote the tickets? I did. I reversed the front and rear measures, and neither of us caught it until the pieces didn't fit. You telling me that to take the blame, or because it's useful to know? Both, I expect. Something in that answer landed better with Mercer than an apology would have. He was quiet a moment, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with iron. I'll give you 4 days, he said finally, not out of kindness. Every day my crew sits idle costs me more than the penalty would recover, and what you've built here is worth more to me over a season than what I'd collect over 1 bad week. 4 days, and I'm charging you for what the delay costs. The idle crew, the feed, the standing wagons. You finish inside that, we're square, and I'll talk to you about carrying my repair business through the winter. You don't, the penalty stands in full, plus what these 4 days already cost. Understood, Thomas said. Mercer swung back onto his horse and rode out, his drivers falling in behind him. And the yard went quiet, in the particular way a place goes quiet after someone said something that changes everything in it. Thomas stood looking at the 2 unfinished wagons a long moment before he turned back toward the shop. Cora was already gone from the doorway. She found her own bag that afternoon and began folding what little she owned into it, careful and unhurried, the way a person folds when they've decided something and don't want to examine the deciding too closely. 3 months, the calendar had said, circled beside Mercer's countdown. She'd cost him a contract, however it ended, and whatever he was too fair a man to say to her face, she could do the arithmetic herself. Mrs. Reed found her folding a second shirt and stood in the doorway. "Going somewhere?" "My 3 months are done." "Past done, if I'm counting right. I don't imagine he wants to keep paying wages to the person who cost him a penalty clause." "He hasn't said that. He doesn't have to." Mrs. Reed lowered herself onto the edge of the cot. "You planning to leave without asking him first?" "I'm planning to make it easier for him to say what he needs to say. I'll take my wages and put them toward what he owes Mercer. It won't cover much. It's what I have." Mrs. Reed watched her fold a third piece of clothing that didn't need folding as carefully as she folded it. "You remind me of him some ways. Deciding what somebody else feels before they've had the chance to say it themselves. He did that once, right after his wife passed. Decided the whole house was better off if he didn't ask anybody for anything, so nobody could tell him no. Took him the better part of 2 years to unlearn it. You've had 3 months. Might be you ought to ask him what he wants before you pack the answer for him." She left without waiting for a reply, and Cora sat a long while after, the half-packed bag open beside her, not finishing it and not putting it away either. Thomas found her that evening in the kitchen, the bag still open on her cot down the hall, though neither said anything about it directly. He sat across from her, in Mrs. Reed's chair rather than his usual place, turning his coffee cup a quarter turn at a time. "I've been going back over Thursday night," he said finally. "The ticket. I read it same as every ticket, and didn't check it against the drawing because I'd stopped needing to. That's the same thing you did wrong, just wearing a different coat. I told Mercer the truth this morning. My error, in the end, whatever caused it. I meant that. You taught me that much these 3 months. Say what's true. Don't dress it up smaller or bigger than it is." "The 3 months are up," Cora said. "They are." He reached into his coat and set something on the table. Not the ledger she'd expected, but the small iron key to the shed, the one he'd carried on his own ring since before she'd arrived. "I want you to stay. Not because of Mercer. Not because of the 4 days we've got left. I decided that before I knew what Thursday's mistake was going to cost us. I'm telling you now so you don't think the only reason I'm asking is that I need the help." She looked at the key a long moment before she trusted her voice. "I thought you'd called me in here to say the opposite." "I know you did. Mrs. Reed told me as much." Something almost like a smile moved at the corner of his mouth, gone before it fully arrived. She's usually right about these things. Cora picked up the key, turned it once, set it down again without pocketing it yet. "Then we still have 4 days. And 2 wagons short their fittings, and not enough stock left without more coal and iron than we've got. That's the part I haven't solved." "I might have." She was already turning it over, in figures and hours rather than feeling. 2 of us, working every hour, might finish it. Might. But we tried something close to that Thursday night, and it's how we ended up here. She met his eyes. "No. We already lost half a day pretending 2 people could carry work meant for 3. I won't make that mistake twice in 1 week." Thomas didn't argue it, which told her he'd already come to some version of the same conclusion. "There's someone who could help. Ben Sutter, apprenticed under my father the last 2 years I was home. Good hands, steady, knows front and rear work better than I do because he actually forged it. He's at a railroad camp 20-some miles east. His contract runs out this fall. He wrote not long after I got here, said he hadn't decided what came next. 20-some miles is most of a day's ride for whoever carries word. Mercer's men ride east tomorrow anyway, to tell the camp the load's running late. If one carries a letter as far as Ben, he could have it by evening. If he says yes, he could be here the morning after." Thomas turned the arithmetic over the way he turned iron, testing where it might give. "That leaves us 2.5 days, maybe 3, once he arrives. It's tight. It's less tight than 2 of us alone. Write the letter," he said. "I'll find out at first light which of Mercer's men rides east." She wrote it that night by lamplight, plainer than she might have written it 3 months before. What the work was, what it paid, how long it might run, and beneath it, the plain fact that she was asking a favor of someone who'd once taught her half of what she knew. The letter went east with Mercer's rider before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Ben Sutter rode into the yard 2 mornings later, road-worn and squinting, a canvas roll of his own tools tied behind his saddle. Broader through the shoulders than she remembered, the way a man goes after 2 years of steady forge work, but he swung down with the same unhurried grin he'd always had. "Didn't think I'd be reading a letter from you asking after wagon fittings," he said. "Turns out quiet wasn't on offer." She introduced him to Thomas plainly, and by the time introductions were finished, Ben already had his coat off, studying the 2 unfinished wagons like a man about to start within the hour. They worked through what remained of that day and most of the next 2, falling into a rhythm that hadn't existed in the yard before. Ben took the heavier forging, his hands sure on stock he'd clearly handled 1,000 times. Thomas matched him heat for heat, the 2 of them settling into the wordless coordination of men who'd apprenticed the same way under different masters. Cora ran the tickets, checked every measure twice against the drawing before either man cut anything, and held the tongs when a third hand was wanted rather than needed for its strength. By the evening of the second full day, the last rear clip cooled in the slack tub, and the following morning they fitted it to the 6th wagon under a still gray sky. Mercer rode out exactly when he'd said he would, and walked all 6 wagons this time, slower and more thorough, running his wrench along seams he'd already checked once. "They'll hold," he said finally, straightening. "All of them. I'll say that plain." He looked between the 3 of them, still road-dusted from the 4 days. "I'm not waiving what the extra days cost me. That's real money out of my pocket, regardless of how the work turned out." "I didn't expect you to," Thomas said. Mercer pulled a folded paper from his coat and set it on the wagon bed, a fair sum, and a heavy one, reckoned against the reforged iron, the extra coal, Ben's wages, the 4 days Mercer was owed. Thomas read it through once, did the arithmetic Cora had already done in her head the night before, and signed it without argument. "That clears it," Mercer said, pocketing the tally, "and clears something else. My repair contracts through the winter. Wagon work, tool work, whatever needs a forge. I'd sooner give that business to a shop that builds something that holds than one that's merely fast. You've shown me which kind you run." He nodded toward Cora and Ben both. "Whoever's minding your tickets and whoever's swinging that second hammer, keep them. That's not advice. That's just what I noticed." He rode out with the same unhurried economy he'd arrived with, and the yard went quiet behind him. The quiet of a held breath finally let go, rather than one still being held. The contract left them with almost nothing to show for it in coin. The ledger, when Cora balanced it that evening, came out closer to even than to profit. The whole hard month accounted for, down to the last nail. But there was the winter's repair work now, promised and likely steady. And there was Ben, who decided by the second day that he wasn't in any hurry to ride back east, and who took a room above the shop that had stood empty since before Cora arrived. Thomas found her at the kitchen table a few evenings later, a new ledger set beside the old one, finally filled to its last page. Inside the fresh cover, in his own plain hand, he'd already written her name. "Figured you'd want to start the next one properly," he said, "seeing as you're the one who'll be keeping it." Cora looked at her own name and his handwriting a moment longer than the gesture strictly required. "There's still the old one's last page to finish first." "There's another book in the drawer when that one's full." He went back to banking the fire for the night without waiting to see what she made of it, though she understood well enough what it meant beneath the plainness. That he'd already decided there would be a next ledger, and a year after this one to fill it. Lily came in not long after, dragging a low stool she'd taken to keeping near the table, and set it beside Cora's chair without asking. She opened her tin box, spread her stones out in their familiar rows, and after a moment's consideration, took a small scrap of iron she'd carried in her apron pocket for weeks. A piece Cora had once shaped and discarded from her father's shop, brought all this way in the bottom of her bag, and set it on the corner of the new ledger as a paperweight, holding the blank pages open against the draft from the door. Mrs. Reed, passing through with the last of the supper dishes, paused long enough to look at the 3 of them there, the girl, the ledger, the scrap of a dead man's iron holding it open, and said nothing at all, which was, by then, its own kind of blessing. Outside, the yard had gone dark and quiet. The forge banked for the night. 6 wagons long since rolled up the mountain road toward a camp that would have its supplies before the season turned. Nothing about the winter ahead was settled. The accounts still thin, the work still hard. But the ledger sat open on the table, waiting to be filled, one plain entry at a time. And that, Cora had learned by now, was the only kind of certainty this life had ever offered anyone worth trusting.